So today I'm going to be talking about my experience interviewing for an assistant psychologist role. I don't really know how to do this video, so I'm just going to talk about my experience and hopefully something important comes through. So first I'll start off with a general overview of how the interview went, because I think that's quite important. So how the interview went was actually pretty awful. I interviewed January 2021, so due to circumstances at that time, it was a Zoom interview. I was interviewed by the consultant clinical psychologist and an assistant psychologist. Unfortunately, as soon as I came into the Zoom meeting room, the assistant psychologist kept disconnecting. I think his internet was just really bad, so he went off forever. It felt like 10 minutes or something, where I was just left with the clinical psychologist, and I was really confused. We were kind of chatting and she was asking me questions about myself, but I wasn't sure if the interview had actually started. There was no indication of, are we continuing with the interview? What is going on here? I think that kind of worked in my favour because it was just a very relaxed conversation, but at the same time we were talking about certain things that could definitely be classified as interview questions. So I don't know, I was just really confused. And then eventually the assistant psychologist came back, but he came back on his phone. You can tell because the camera angle was different. Throughout the entire interview, while he was on his phone, he kept trying to connect to the Zoom meeting on his computer, but when there's two devices in the same online call, they feedback off each other, especially when they're not muted. So that kept happening, just random feedback noises whenever he tried to connect, and that kind of went on a few times throughout the interview, so it was really disruptive. And I think eventually he gave up and just stayed on his phone, which I really appreciated. And then midway through the interview, someone else comes on the call and no one says anything for what feels like 5 to 10 seconds, which is a long time if you're just sat staring at each other on the screen. Because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know who this person was. I thought it was someone else who was meant to be on the interview panel. And then the clinical psychologist says, so-and-so, can you please come back in 15 minutes? We're not done with this candidate. So it turns out she was the next candidate to be interviewed after me, and she had popped into the meeting room early. Basically what I'm trying to say is the whole interview structurally was really terrible. I kept getting interrupted. I would be answering questions, and then my train of thought would get distracted because there was just so much kerfuffle going on. It felt like a disaster. It was the most disruptive interview I had ever gone for, but I got the job, so I guess I can't really complain. So what I did to prepare for this interview was all the basic things that you would do in a normal interview. So research the company, research the service. I think all of that is pretty obvious. Additionally, if you are going for an AP interview, make sure you research the client group that you are potentially going to be working with. So don't only read up on peer-reviewed journals and literature, also look at articles, videos, testimonies, anything to do with the client group. Make sure you get a clinical but also a holistic idea of what that particular client group is like. And one thing that I did extra was I also looked up how COVID had affected this particular client group. And this is probably less relevant if you are not interviewing in a COVID climate, but I reckon this whole situation will have a ripple effect for most client groups for months or years on. So make sure that you at least have some idea of how they were impacted by the pandemic. The most crucial thing that I did was watch a lot of YouTube videos on what people's experiences were like interviewing for assistant psychologist roles. So I literally would type into the YouTube search bar my experience in an AP interview, and I would just watch as many videos as I could, and I'm gonna list some of the videos that I watched in the description box below. Some of the channels that I really want to shout out to, like PsychAssist, I think VeePsych she's called, Sharon B, the Oxford Psych, all of these were invaluable resources on how to get through an AP interview. And I'm telling you, I could not have done the interview successfully if I had not watched those videos, because they told me what to look out for, what kind of questions they would ask in interviews. And what I did was I literally on Microsoft Word, just as I was watching these videos, I would list questions that I thought would be relevant to my interview, and come up with my answers for them as well. And by the end of the evening, I had 25 pages in Microsoft Word just looking at research on the client group and interview questions, as well as my answers to them. One thing I did that I really would not recommend is doing all of your preparation and research the night before. It was one of the most stressful evenings in my life, and to this day, I still don't know why I did that. I'm a serial procrastinator. I always have been, but that was bad. You know, don't do that. Don't prepare for an interview the night before. And to be fair to myself, it wasn't like I was doing all of my preparation the night before. I was definitely thinking about the interview, and it was stewing in my head, and I was definitely doing a lot of like informal research, I guess you can call it. I was definitely looking up things and keeping myself informed, but in terms of like actually like, okay, you need to sit down and actually collate all of this information together, I did all of that the night before, like the notes, the literature, the YouTube stuff. Don't do that. Don't do what I did. Do it as soon as you find out you have an interview. Do it before you even have an interview. Do all of that. Don't do it at the last moment, because it's not good for your mental well-being. So now I'm going to go into some of the questions that I got asked during the interview. So the first one was, tell us a bit about yourself and why you are interested in this role. So I think that's quite a basic question that you get in every interview, not just an AP interview. So what I did was I rehashed some of my CV, and I know some people will say, don't do that, don't just give them a history of your CV, like why would you do that, nobody wants to hear that. But the way I did it was in the form of a narrative. So I talked about some of the choices that I made at this point led to other things, and how those things made me feel, and how those things impacted and made changes in my life. So it wasn't just rehashing my CV, it was literally telling them a bit about my life story, what I'm like as a person, what some of my values are, what is important to me as an individual. Yeah, it was a rehash of my CV, but it was very much tied in with my thoughts about it, my feelings on certain subject matters, and I think it did a good job of answering the question, tell us about yourself and why you're interested in this role. So the next question that they asked was, tell us about a case you worked and what you learned from it. And this was the point in the interview where I must have talked for about 15 minutes straight without stopping. I obviously can't tell you what my answer is specifically, but what I did was I talked about one of the most complicated cases that I worked on. And you know it's complicated because it's one of those cases where you think about all the time and you wonder how this person's doing. And I talked about the good things that happened within that case, some of the small successes that I had, and some of the very large failures that I had with this person. And by the way, this wasn't a clinical case. I wasn't working with this person in a clinical capacity, so it doesn't have to be like strictly clinical. If you have support work experience that is relevant as well. This was actually a volunteer experience that I had, and actually that case had a really sad ending because in an official capacity there was very little that I could do for this person because they needed help that was beyond what we offered as a service. The next question that I got asked was, what does clinical supervision mean to you? This question would have stumped me if I hadn't done all that research watching YouTube videos. I watched this video by PsychAssist, and he was basically saying, whenever this question appears in an interview, they are looking for you to be reflective. So be reflective. Basically took his advice, but I'm telling you, if I hadn't watched that video, which I will link down below, I wouldn't have been able to answer this question. The next question that I got was, what do you think the role of the psychologist is within an MDT, a multidisciplinary team? And I made 2 points here. So the first point was that a psychological approach is really, at its very core, recognizing the human element in this individual. This person, this client that you're working with, is a complex human being, and they have complex human being problems. They have thoughts and feelings and experiences that could be vastly different to yours and immensely unique to them. Sometimes it's possible to forget that, especially when you get so caught up in work. When you're writing these reports that are so clinical and you're talking about this person as though they are an object that's meant to respond to whatever intervention you're bringing to the table, but it doesn't work that way, because they're not just a check mark on your to-do list. They're not just a number in an Excel sheet. This is an individual with all the complications that every individual in this world has. So sometimes you have to recognize that you can't condense this person down to a paragraph in a report or a statistic on this chart or a point on this graph. You have to look at them as a human being with all those sometimes irritating but beautiful complicated complexities. That's what the psychologist on the team has to remember. So that was one of the points that I made. And the second point was, a lot of services will talk about well-being of the service users. What people don't talk about enough is also the well-being of the staff. I know in some places they do formal support sessions for staff, but you have to recognize that not everybody is going to access that. So as someone on the psychology team, building rapport is really important with your colleagues because sometimes it's these informal chats that could be really vital or could contribute to their overall well-being. I think that's basically the gist of what I said. I talked a lot during this interview. Most of my answers were pretty long. The next question was, what does safeguarding mean to you? And this was the question that I completely bombed. I kind of had an idea of what it meant, especially to me, but I didn't know how to articulate that. And as I was trying to do that, that's when this other person came into the Zoom meeting, and it was really disruptive, and I lost my train of thought, and I gave a really short answer, which I think was like the most obvious answer about protecting them from themselves and from other people. It was a really bad answer. So the next question, on a specific case, if you disagree with another member of the MDT, what will you do to convince them that you are right? And this was the question where I was literally like, I'm gonna need a minute to think about this because I had no idea how to respond to this question. This was not one that I had researched or had any inkling about, and this was not something that I had done in my previous experiences. So I literally just sat there in silence for a minute thinking about it. And I said, well, I think this is a pretty bad answer, but basically what I said was, well, if I feel like I have to convince someone that I am right, then there must be a reason for that. It's not just going to be like a gut feeling for me. There will be evidence, literature, journals, case studies, client history, records and reports. So in trying to convince someone else, I will have a whole array of tangible evidence to back up what I'm saying. But I also added that at the end of the day, it's not about whether I'm right, it's about the person that we are meant to take care of. It's about this client. I have to draw a very clear distinction between their best interest and my ego. And If I'm arguing from an egotistical point of view, then that's when I know I need to back down. If I'm arguing in their best interest, then that's where I will have all the evidence to back it up. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I guess another thing that I would also say is, I didn't say this in the interview, I'm just thinking of it now. I would also look at integrating both approaches to see whether we can work together as an MDT. That's probably what I would add to that answer if I was asked that question now. The last question that I got was, what do you think you would struggle with most in this job? So at the point of this interview, I was actually working in an honorary AP role, and that was my first experience ever as an AP. And what I really struggled with was the lack of structure. It was almost like you make the job whatever you want it to be. So I had to take a lot of time to even recognize that, oh, I have to do some reflection and figure out what I want to learn from this placement, and then I have to go out and ask for it and try and get it and do it. And that's something that's very contrary to the industry that I came from previously. I came from a country and an industry where it was very straightforward compared to this. It was, you've got your KPIs, you do all these processes, and then you hit your KPIs and all this well. You never really have any autonomy, and in that honorary AP role, I had all the autonomy in the world, and I didn't know what to do with it. So that's what I said in response to that question. And I said, even though I've been working on it, I still would struggle to this day. Lack of direction, lack of guidance, lack of structure, all of that. I find it difficult to navigate when there's too much space, which I know sounds a bit funny, but I guess I like rules, and I like being confined to rules, I guess. Need to know what I'm doing next and need to have a lot of clarity on things. That's all the questions I can remember. I'm sure there was more, but these were the ones that really stuck out to me, and these were the ones that caused me the most trouble, I guess, in terms of answering. I just want to say before I end this video, which has gone on forever, when it comes to AP interviews in particular, hearing directly from the people who have experienced them is so freaking crucial. So if you haven't already, I mean, if you're watching this, you probably have, but watch as many of these videos that you can, and come up with like a list of questions and your answers, because that's really, really important. Don't take it too personally if you're not successful on the first try. There are very, very few AP roles around, and the few that are floating around, everyone's trying to grab. And sometimes when people put out these adverts saying they're hiring, they're not actually looking outside of the company or service to fill that role. They might already have someone in mind, but they're obligated to put the ad out. And I think, based on what other people have said as well, it's such a competitive industry. If you are successful the first or second or third try, it's probably less to do with how fantastic you are and more to do with just pure luck. A lot of people who successfully get AP roles are just really, really, really lucky. I think most of the time people who interview for them, most of them are perfectly qualified to do it. And if you don't get it, it's because that other person was just scored ever so slightly better than you on the interview and they got the job. And there's so many factors involved, and a huge chunk of it is, in my opinion, luck. So anyway, all the best if you are applying to be an AP, if you are going for an interview soon. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear from you, so leave them down in the comments below.